The night was quiet, just like any other Tuesday for Special Agent Raymond Wilson. After 14 hours at the field office, all he wanted was a hot shower and sleep. The stack of case files could wait until morning. His eyes burned from staring at screens all day, tracking money trails that might lead to the drug ring they'd been chasing for months. The coffee had stopped working hours ago. Rain tapped gently against his windshield as he drove through the empty streets. The yellow glow of streetlights reflected off wet pavement, creating little pools of light in the darkness. Raymond checked his watch. Almost midnight. His wife would be asleep by now, but she'd left dinner in the microwave. 15 years, with the FBI, and she still waited up most nights. Tonight, though, he'd texted her to go to bed. The blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror without warning. Raymond frowned, checking his speedometer. He'd been going exactly 3 miles, under the limit, cautious on the wet roads. Maybe a taillight was out. He signaled and pulled over properly, reaching for his wallet with his ID. Officer Thomas Dawson sat in his patrol car for nearly 2 minutes before approaching. On any other night, Raymond might not have noticed. But years of training had taught him to catalog details, and something felt off. He kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, the way he taught community members during police interaction workshops. When the officer finally approached, Raymond rolled down his window, careful to move slowly. "Evening, officer." The beam from Dawson's flashlight hit Raymond's face with unnecessary brightness. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Of course, I'm reaching for my wallet now," Raymond said, narrating his movements the way he always advised civilians to do. "Also, I should inform you that I'm a federal agent." He slowly removed his FBI credentials along with his license. The flashlight beam didn't waver. "Get out of the car." Raymond blinked, confused. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" I said, "Get out of the car. Now." Dawson's voice had an edge that sent warning signals through Raymond's mind. Something was very wrong. "I'm going to comply, but I'd like to understand the reason for the stop." Raymond kept his voice steady, professional. He'd been in tense situations before. De-escalation was key. As Raymond carefully opened the door, he noticed Dawson's hand already resting on his holstered weapon. That wasn't standard procedure for a routine traffic stop. Raymond stepped out slowly, hands still visible. "Turn around." Hands against the vehicle. "Officer Dawson," Raymond said, reading the name tag. "I'm following your instructions, but again, I'm a federal agent and You people always think you're special, don't you?" Dawson cut him off. The words carried a weight that made Raymond's stomach tighten. He'd heard that tone before, that phrasing, not as an agent but as a black man. "Sir, I'm just trying to understand." The situation escalated in seconds. Later, Raymond would remember fragments. Dawson's face twisting with sudden rage, the officer's hand moving to his weapon. Raymond raising his open palms higher, saying, "Officer, I'm unarmed." Then the crack of the gunshot, shockingly loud in the quiet street. The pain came a heartbeat later, burning through Raymond's shoulder. He staggered backward, clutching at the wound as warm blood seeped between his fingers. Through the haze of shock, he registered Dawson still pointing the weapon at him, eyes wide with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Officer?" Raymond gasped, fighting to stay upright, to stay conscious. "I'm a federal agent. You just shot a federal agent." For a moment, doubt flickered across Dawson's face. Then his radio crackled and a voice asked for status. The sound seemed to snap him back to reality. "Shots fired," Dawson reported. "Suspect wounded." Not agent. Suspect. Raymond slid down against his car, the pain building with each heartbeat. He pressed harder against the wound, thinking of pressure points, thinking of his training, thinking of his wife waiting at home. "My credentials," Raymond said through gritted teeth. "In your hand, FBI." Dawson looked down at the badge and ID he still held in his left hand. For the first time, his expression changed to something like concern. Not for the man bleeding on the ground, but for himself. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed into a chaos of flashing lights and sirens, an ambulance, more police cars. Raymond focused on his breathing, on staying awake. A paramedic knelt beside him, cutting away his shirt sleeve. FBI, Raymond told the paramedic. Call my office and my wife. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Raymond saw Dawson talking with a senior officer, gesturing wildly, already creating his version of events. But what Dawson didn't know was that Raymond's car, like many FBI vehicles, had a dashboard camera. It had captured everything. In the ambulance, fighting waves of pain as the paramedics worked to stabilize him, Raymond found himself thinking about his father. How he'd sat Raymond down at 13 and explained the rules for surviving traffic stops as a black man. Keep your hands visible, be polite, don't argue, comply with all instructions. Raymond had followed all those rules tonight, and he'd still been shot. The hospital emergency room blazed with harsh fluorescent light. Doctors spoke in rapid, urgent tones. Someone cut away his clothes. Someone else pushed pain medication that made the edges of his vision blur. My wife, Raymond kept saying. Someone needs to call my wife. A nurse with kind eyes promised they had contacted her, then asked if there was anyone else. My supervisor, Raymond said. FBI Assistant Director Lee. This wasn't a random shooting. The officer. He knew what he was doing. The nurse nodded, her expression careful, neutral. But Raymond had interviewed enough witnesses to recognize the look of someone who believed him. Sometime later, minutes or hours, Raymond couldn't tell through the haze of medication, he heard familiar voices. His wife's gentle touch on his good arm, her face streaked with tears but composed. And beside her, the stern figure of Assistant Director Lee. We have the dash cam footage, Lee told him quietly, and the body cam. We'll handle this, Raymond. Even through the pain medication, Raymond understood what that meant. No cover-up, no lost evidence, no friendly investigation that found no wrongdoing. He knew what he was doing, Raymond repeated, fighting to keep his eyes open. The things he said. Rest. Now, his wife whispered, we've got this. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, Raymond's last thoughts were not of the shooting but of the moment that would come after his recovery. The moment he would sit in a courtroom and tell a jury exactly what had happened on that rainy night. How he had followed all the rules, done everything right. How Officer Dawson had looked at his FBI credentials and still seen only the color of his skin. And for the first time since the shooting, Raymond felt something besides pain. He felt purpose. The dash cam would show what happened. The body cam would reveal Dawson's words, his tone, his intent. And Raymond would recover, would testify, would make sure this case didn't disappear like so many others. Justice wouldn't come easily. Raymond knew the statistics, knew how rarely officers faced consequences even with clear evidence. But he also knew that his position gave him advantages most victims of police violence never had. He would use every one of those advantages. For himself, and for all those who had followed the rules and still ended up bleeding on the pavement with no badge to protect them, no camera to capture the truth. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and stale air. Raymond opened his eyes to the soft beeping of monitors and the dull throb in his shoulder. 3 days had passed since the shooting. 3 days of doctors, nurses, pain medication, and the steady stream of visitors wearing FBI jackets. His wife. Diane sat beside the bed, her fingers typing rapidly on her laptop. She'd barely left his side, working remotely between talking to doctors and fielding calls from concerned family members. When she noticed Raymond was awake, she set the computer aside and reached for his hand. "How's the pain?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Manageable," Raymond replied, though the ache ran deeper than the physical wound. "Any updates?" Diane's expression hardened slightly. "Your assistant director Lee has been here twice while you were sleeping. The investigation is moving quickly." Before she could say more, there was a knock at the door. 2 people entered, Assistant Director Lee and a woman Raymond didn't recognize, wearing a Department of Justice badge. "Agent Wilson," Lee nodded, his usual formality softened by genuine concern. "This is Olivia Chen from the Civil Rights Division at DOJ. She's heading the federal investigation." Chen stepped forward, her handshake firm. Agent Wilson, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Raymond adjusted himself in the hospital bed, wincing slightly. So do I. But I'm glad the DOJ is involved. We have reviewed the dash cam footage, Chen said, getting straight to the point. And Officer Dawson's body camera. We've also obtained warrant access to his personal devices and departmental records. The room fell silent for a moment. Raymond knew what that meant. They'd found something significant enough to expand the investigation beyond just the shooting. Tell me, Raymond said. Lee and Chen exchanged glances before Lee spoke. It's not pretty, Raymond. Dawson has a history of complaints all involving minority drivers. Most were dismissed or buried. His text messages and social media accounts show a clear pattern of racial hostility. The local police chief claims they had no knowledge of these issues, Chen added, her tone making it clear she didn't believe that for a second. Raymond wasn't surprised. He'd seen this pattern before, both as an agent and as a black man in America. What did surprise him was the speed and seriousness of the investigation. There's something else, Lee continued. After news of the shooting broke, 5 other officers from Dawson's precinct came forward. They've provided statements about his behavior, comments he's made, things they witnessed but never reported. Why now? Diane asked, voicing the question. Raymond was thinking. Because it's an FBI agent he shot, Raymond answered before Lee could. Because I have a badge. The weight of those words hung in the room. The uncomfortable truth that Raymond's position was the reason this case wasn't being swept under the rug like so many others. Chen nodded, acknowledging what remained unspoken. Yes, that's part of it. But also because the evidence is overwhelming. The dash cam footage alone. She paused, collecting herself. We've already conducted 16 interviews. His partner, his supervisors, previous complainants. We're building an airtight case. Where is Dawson now? Raymond asked. In custody, Lee replied. No bail. He's been charged with attempted murder, assault on a federal officer, and civil rights violations. The hate crime charges are pending, but likely. A nurse entered to check Raymond's vitals, and the conversation paused. When she left, Chen pulled a chair closer to the bed. Agent Wilson, I need to prepare you for what's coming. This case will get attention. A lot of it. There will be press. There will be public demonstrations, both in support of you and, unfortunately, in support of Dawson. Raymond had expected as much. High-profile cases involving police shootings always became lightning rods. Some would see him as a symbol, others as a threat to their worldview. There's already talk of making an example of this case, Lee added. From both sides. The police union is distancing themselves from Dawson, but there are still those who will defend him. And my testimony? Raymond asked. When? Not for a while, Chen replied. First, you need to recover. Then we'll need your formal statement, but we have enough to proceed with charges without rushing you. After they left, Diane moved to sit on the edge of the bed. She took Raymond's hand, her fingers tracing the wedding band they'd exchanged 11 years ago. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Not just about your recovery, about all of this. The attention, the backlash. Raymond squeezed her hand. I know, but this is bigger than us now. It always was, she said. The next few days brought a steady flow of information. Raymond's FBI colleagues kept him updated on the investigation's progress. Internal Affairs had suspended 3 supervisors from Dawson's precinct for failure to address previous complaints. The police chief was holding press conferences, promising reforms and full cooperation. A week after the shooting, Raymond was cleared to go home. As Diane helped him into their house, he noticed the extra car parked across the street. FBI protection detail, another reminder that this case had escalated beyond a typical shooting. That evening, as they sat in their living room watching the news coverage, Raymond's phone rang. It was Chen from the DOJ. Agent Wilson, I wanted you to hear this from me. First, we've uncovered a group chat involving Dawson and 4 other officers from different precincts. The content is disturbing. Racist messages, jokes about violence against minorities, sharing of white supremacist material. Raymond closed his eyes, absorbing this but not surprised by it. We're expanding the investigation to include these other officers, Chen continued. But more importantly, we found specific messages where Dawson discussed targeting black drivers, including comments about teaching them their place. Some messages specifically mentioned wanting to pull over suits, well-dressed black men in nice cars. The implication was clear. Raymond hadn't been randomly selected for a traffic stop. His profile, a black man in a nice car, had made him a target. There's one more thing, Chen said, her voice tightening slightly. Dawson recognized your FBI credentials immediately. The body cam shows that clearly. He knew you were a federal agent when he fired. After the call ended, Raymond sat in silence for a long time, Diane's hand on his good shoulder. The physical pain was still there, but it was being overtaken by a different kind of hurt. The confirmation that he'd been targeted for who he was, not anything he'd done. 2 weeks into his recovery, Raymond received another visitor. District Attorney Harold Park, a serious man with a reputation for political ambition. The grand jury has returned an indictment on all charges, Park informed him. I'll be prosecuting this case personally. Raymond understood the subtext. This case would be high profile, and Park wanted the visibility, but his ambition might actually serve justice in this instance. We have a strong case, Park continued, but your testimony will be crucial. The defense will try to paint Dawson as having made a mistake under pressure. Your account will show clear intent. When? Raymond asked. Trial is set for 3 months from now. Fast-tracked given the circumstances. After Park left, Raymond stood at his living room window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood street. Somewhere in the city, Dawson sat in a cell. Around the country, news outlets were covering the story. Online, people were taking sides, arguing about what had really happened that night. But Raymond had the truth. It was there in the dashcam, footage in Dawson's own words captured by his body camera, in the text messages now being examined by investigators. The truth that Raymond had been targeted not for any action, but simply for existing as a black man in a space where Dawson thought he didn't belong. His shoulder would heal. Physical therapy would restore his range of motion. But some wounds went deeper than muscle and bone. As Raymond watched the sunset through his window, he thought about the months ahead, the trial, the testimony, the public scrutiny. He thought about all the cases like his that never saw justice, because the victims didn't have badges, didn't have dash cams, didn't have the full weight of the FBI and DOJ behind them. And he made a decision. This case wouldn't just be about seeking justice for himself. It would be about using his position to shine a light on a system that had protected Dawson for years, despite numerous complaints. About making sure that the next time an officer like Dawson pulled someone over, they might think twice before letting their hatred dictate their actions. The path ahead would be difficult, but as the pain medication wore off and the ache in his shoulder returned, Raymond welcomed it as a reminder. A reminder of why this fight mattered. A reminder that healing, both his own and the deeper wounds in the system, would require more than just time. It would require truth, accountability, and the courage to face both. 2 months after the shooting, Raymond stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with his good hand. His shoulder had healed enough that he no longer needed the sling, but certain movements still sent pain shooting down his arm. The doctor said he might always have that reminder. Today marked his first day back at the FBI office. Desk duty only, but it was a start. More importantly, it was also the day of the preliminary hearing for Officer Dawson's case. You don't have to go back to work so soon, Diane said, appearing in the doorway. Everyone would understand if you took more time. Raymond met her eyes, in the mirror. I need this, I need normal. But nothing had been normal since that rainy night. Their home phone rang constantly with reporters seeking interviews. Their neighborhood had seen both supportive rallies and angry protesters. Raymond's face had appeared on national news, usually alongside Dawson's mugshot, creating a visual narrative of victim and perpetrator that made Raymond uncomfortable despite its accuracy. Besides, he added, turning to face his wife. The hearing is this afternoon. I want to go straight from the office. The FBI field office welcomed Raymond back with restrained warmth, handshakes, nods of respect, and a mountain of paperwork waiting on his desk. His colleagues treated him with a mix of deference and curiosity. He was both one of them and something else now, a symbol in a larger conversation about policing, race, and accountability. Assistant Director Lee stopped by his desk mid-morning. How's it feel to be back? Better than staring at my living room walls, Raymond replied, sorting through case files. Lee lowered his voice. The hearing today, you ready? As ready as I'll ever be. You won't be alone in there. Half the office is planning to attend. Raymond nodded, grateful but also aware of the pressure that support carried. This wasn't just his case anymore. It belonged to the Bureau, to the public, to everyone with a stake in either side of the debate. At lunch, he met with Olivia Chen from the DOJ and District Attorney Park to prepare for the hearing. They sat in a private room at a cafe near the courthouse, reviewing what would happen. This is just procedural, Park reminded him. The judge will review the charges, hear basic arguments, and determine if there's enough evidence to proceed to trial. Which there is, Chen added. More than enough. Will I need to testify? Raymond asked. Not today, Park said. But I want you there. The judge should see you, and so should Dawson and his attorney. As they discussed the legal strategy, Raymond noticed Chen studying him with concern. How are you really doing? She asked when Park stepped away to take a call. Not just physically. Raymond considered deflecting, giving the standard "I'm fine" response. But Chen had been in the trenches with this case from the beginning. She deserved honesty. I have nightmares, he admitted. Not about getting shot, strangely enough, but about what would have happened if I wasn't FBI, if there hadn't been cameras, if it had just been my word against his. Chen nodded, understanding. That's why this case matters. Because of all the ones where there weren't cameras. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and demonstrators when they arrived that afternoon. Signs supporting law enforcement stood alongside others demanding justice. Camera flashes created a strobe effect as Raymond walked up the steps flanked by Park and his FBI colleagues. Inside, the courtroom was packed but orderly. Raymond took his seat in the front row behind the prosecution table. Across the aisle, Officer Dawson sat beside his attorney, a sharp-featured man named Victor Walsh who specialized in defending police officers. Raymond had seen Dawson's picture countless times since the shooting, but this was the first time seeing him in person since that night. He looked smaller somehow, his uniform exchanged for a suit that seemed too large for his frame. When Dawson glanced over, their eyes met briefly before he quickly looked away. The judge, an older woman named Honorable Patricia Rivera, entered and the proceedings began. Park presented the charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, and hate crimes. He outlined the evidence, the dash cam footage, the body camera, the text messages and social media posts, the testimony from other officers. Your Honor, Park concluded, the evidence will show that Officer Dawson not only shot Agent Wilson without provocation, but did so with clear racial animus and with full knowledge that he was a federal agent. When Walsh rose for the defense, his strategy became immediately clear. Your Honor, we don't dispute that Officer Dawson discharged his weapon, but we contend that this was a case of mistaken threat assessment during a high-stress situation, not attempted murder and certainly not a hate crime. Walsh paced slightly as he spoke. Officer Dawson was working alone, at night, in an area where there had been recent armed robberies. He observed suspicious behavior and reacted according to his training when he perceived a threat. Raymond felt his jaw tighten. Suspicious behavior. The phrase was so familiar, used to justify countless stops, searches, and sometimes violence. His suspicious behavior had been driving slightly under the speed limit on a rainy night. As for the alleged text messages and social media posts, Walsh continued, we contend that these are being taken out of context and have no bearing on my client's actions that night. This is an attempt to paint Officer Dawson as a racist when in reality, He was simply a police officer doing his job under difficult circumstances. The defense's claims rang hollow against the mountain of evidence, but Raymond knew that Walsh wasn't really arguing to the judge. He was setting up their narrative for the public, for potential jurors, for anyone willing to believe that a police officer's fear justified shooting an unarmed man who had identified himself as FBI. After both sides presented their arguments, Judge Rivera spoke. Based on the evidence presented, I find more than sufficient cause to proceed to trial on all charges. Bail remains denied due to the serious nature of the charges and the defendant's position as a law enforcement officer. She set a trial date for 6 weeks later, and the hearing was adjourned. As people began filing out, Raymond noticed Dawson's parents sitting in the back row. Their faces showed the same stunned disbelief he'd seen on the families of defendants countless times in his FBI career. They couldn't reconcile the charges with the son they'd raised. Outside, the media frenzy intensified. Park stopped to make a brief statement, emphasizing the strength of the evidence and his confidence in securing a conviction. Raymond declined to speak, letting Park handle the public side of the case. As they walked to their cars, Chen fell in step beside Raymond. The real work starts now. Walsh will try to get some of the evidence thrown out, especially the text messages and social media posts. He'll argue they're prejudicial. Will that work? Raymond asked. I don't think so. Not with this judge. But prepare yourself. The defense is going to get ugly. They'll dig into your background, try to find anything they can use against you. Raymond nodded. He'd expected as much. They won't find anything. It doesn't matter if they find anything real. They'll twist what they find or invent what they don't. That's how these cases work. Over the next several weeks, Raymond's prediction proved accurate. The defense filed motion after motion to suppress evidence, to change venue, to dismiss charges. Judge Rivera denied most, though she did place some limitations on how the prosecution could use Dawson's social media history. Raymond divided his time between physical therapy, desk duty at the FBI, and preparation for his testimony. Chen and Park met with him weekly, running through potential questions and preparing him for the defense's likely strategies. They'll try to rattle you, Park warned during one session. They'll try to make you angry, to show emotion that they can paint as bias or vengefulness. I know, Raymond said. I've testified before. Not like this, Chen countered. Not when you're the victim. Not when the defense will be trying to make you seem threatening or untrustworthy based solely on who you are. The truth of her words hit home. Raymond had testified in dozens of cases, but always as an FBI agent presenting evidence. Now his credibility would be attacked not because of his actions, but because of his identity. The very thing that had made him a target for Dawson would be used to undermine him in court. As the trial date approached, public interest in the case continued to grow. National civil rights leaders held rallies supporting Raymond. Police unions issued carefully worded statements supporting proper legal process, while distancing themselves from Dawson specifically. The night before the trial was set to begin, Raymond stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the FBI security detail still parked on their street. Diane came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his back. Tomorrow, she said softly. Tomorrow, he echoed. Whatever happened in that courtroom would affect not just Dawson's future or Raymond's healing process, but potentially policing practices across the country. The evidence was strong, but Raymond had seen strong cases fall apart before. I just want the truth to matter, he said quietly. That's all. I want what actually happened to be what decides this case. Diane tightened her arms around him. Then tell the truth, as clearly and calmly as you can. The rest isn't up to you. Raymond turned to face her, seeing in her eyes the same mix of determination and apprehension he felt. Tomorrow the trial would begin, and with it, the true test of whether a uniform and a badge could shield someone from consequences, or whether justice could prevail even when the lines of power and privilege were crossed. The courtroom fell silent as Raymond took the witness stand. 6 weeks of trial proceedings had led to this moment. He had sat through opening statements, watched experts analyze the dash cam footage frame by frame, and listened as fellow officers testified about Dawson's history of concerning behavior. Now it was his turn to speak. He felt the weight of every eye in the room, the jury, a mix of ages and backgrounds who had listened attentively throughout the trial. Dawson, who rarely looked directly at him, the packed gallery of reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers, and Diane, whose steady presence in the front row had anchored him through the difficult days. District Attorney Park approached. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "Raymond Wilson. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "How long have you been with the FBI, Agent Wilson?" 15 years. Park nodded, establishing Raymond's credentials before the jury. "And prior to the incident in question, had you ever been shot in the line of duty?" "No. I'd never discharged my weapon or been fired upon in 15 years of service. Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the night of April 17th. Raymond took a breath and began recounting the events. The routine traffic stop, his clear identification as a federal agent, Dawson's escalating hostility, and the moment the officer fired his weapon. He spoke steadily, without embellishment, describing exactly what had happened just as he'd been trained to do in countless FBI reports. "At any point did you make threatening movements toward Officer Dawson?" Park asked. "No. My hands remained, visible at all times. I verbally identified myself as FBI and showed my credentials. And in your professional assessment as a federal law enforcement officer, was there any justification for Officer Dawson to draw his weapon, much less fire it?" "None whatsoever." Park continued guiding Raymond through his testimony for another 20 minutes before concluding. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Rivera turned to the defense table. "Your witness, Mr. Walsh." Victor Walsh rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. His reputation for aggressive cross-examination had preceded him, and Raymond had been prepared by the prosecution team for what might come. "Agent Wilson," Walsh began, his tone conversational, almost friendly, "you testified that you've never discharged your weapon in the line of duty. Is that unusual for an FBI agent with 15 years of experience?" "Not particularly. Many agents go their entire careers without firing their weapons outside of training." "So you don't typically work dangerous assignments?" Raymond felt the subtle trap in the question. "I've worked numerous dangerous assignments, including organized crime and counterterrorism, but good agents try to resolve situations without violence whenever possible." Walsh nodded, seemingly appreciative of the answer, but Raymond could see the calculation behind his eyes. "On the night in question, you were driving home after a 14-hour workday. Is that correct?" "Yes." 14 hours is a long shift. Were you tired?" "I was alert enough to drive safely, if that's what you're asking." Walsh paced a few steps. "And it was raining that night?" "Yes, a light rain. Dark, rainy conditions. A tired federal agent. Is it possible that when Officer Dawson approached your vehicle, you might have seemed less cooperative than you remember?" Raymond kept his expression neutral. "No. I followed all standard protocols for a traffic stop." "In your FBI training, are you taught how to respond to traffic stops?" "Yes. We're taught to identify ourselves clearly and follow officer instructions. But as an FBI agent, you're used to being the one giving orders, not taking them. Isn't that right?" "Objection," Park called. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Rivera responded. Walsh shifted tactics. "Agent Wilson, you testified that Officer Dawson seemed hostile from the beginning of the encounter. But isn't it true that law enforcement officers are trained to maintain an authoritative presence during traffic stops for their own safety? There's a difference between authoritative and hostile. Officer Dawson's language and demeanor went well beyond professional protocol." Walsh walked back to the defense table, picking up a document. "Your performance reviews at the FBI consistently rate you as excellent in areas of observation and attention to detail. Yet you want us to believe that in the stress of the moment, with rain falling at night, you perfectly recalled Officer Dawson's exact words and tone." "I do remember them clearly, yes. Being shot tends to make moments like that memorable." Few jurors nodded slightly, and Walsh noticed. He changed direction again. "Agent Wilson, have you ever made a mistake in the field? Ever misread a situation or a suspect's intentions? Everyone makes mistakes, but I've never mistakenly shot someone, if that's what you're implying." For the next hour, Walsh continued his cross-examination, trying various angles to undermine Raymond's testimony. He questioned Raymond's memory, suggested he might have made threatening movements without realizing it, and implied that his status as an FBI agent might have made him less respectful toward local law enforcement. Through it all, Raymond maintained his composure, answering directly without showing the frustration he felt. He'd been on enough witness stands to recognize Walsh's tactics, trying to provoke an emotional response that would make him seem less credible. Finally, Walsh returned to his seat. No further questions. Park stood for redirect, clarifying points the defense had tried to muddy before Raymond was dismissed from the stand. As he returned to his seat behind the prosecution table, he caught Diane's eye. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. The next day, the defense began presenting their case. Their strategy became increasingly clear. They weren't contesting that Dawson had shot Raymond, but were trying to frame it as a reasonable mistake made under pressure rather than a racially motivated attack. Their first witness was a police trainer who testified about the split-second decisions officers sometimes needed to make in potentially dangerous situations. The expert acknowledged under cross-examination, however, that nothing in the dash cam footage suggested Raymond posed any threat. On the third day of the defense's case, Dawson himself took the stand. He had lost weight since the shooting, his once imposing presence diminished by months in custody. He spoke quietly as he described his version of events. "I observed a vehicle traveling slowly in an area where we'd had recent reports of drug trafficking," Dawson testified. "When I approached the vehicle, the driver made a sudden movement that I perceived as reaching for a weapon, even after he identified himself as FBI," Walsh asked. "In the moment, with the rain and poor visibility, I wasn't certain that the identification was genuine. There have been cases of criminals impersonating law enforcement." Raymond listened carefully, noting how Dawson's account contradicted not only his own recollection but also the video evidence the jury had seen. The dash cam clearly showed Raymond's hands visible on the steering wheel, his slow narrated movements as he reached for his credentials. During cross-examination, Park was methodical in dismantling Dawson's story. He played the body cam footage, asking Dawson to explain his words, particularly the phrase "you people always think you're special," which had been captured clearly on the audio. "What did you mean by you people?" Park asked. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "I meant federal agents. They sometimes act like they're above local law enforcement. And yet, Agent Wilson's FBI credentials were clearly visible in your hand when you fired your weapon. The body cam shows that. It was a high-stress situation. I reacted based on my training." Park then introduced the text messages the jury hadn't yet seen. Messages where Dawson had specifically discussed targeting black drivers, including those who looked too successful or were driving nice cars. "Were these messages also part of your police training?" Park asked, his voice sharp. "Objection," Walsh called, argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Rivera ruled. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the messages, seen Dawson's discomfort. For the remainder of the week, the defense called character witnesses, fellow officers who testified to Dawson's professionalism, family members who insisted he wasn't racist, a psychologist who suggested he might have been suffering from PTSD from previous on-duty incidents. Throughout the defense's case, Raymond watched the jury. Some seemed sympathetic to the notion that policing was difficult, dangerous work. Others appeared skeptical of the attempts to explain away what they'd seen on video. But all were paying close attention, taking notes, fully engaged in the serious matter before them. On the final day of testimony, Walsh called his last witness, a use-of-force expert who testified that in certain circumstances, officers might perceive threats that later proved unfounded. "In your expert opinion," Walsh asked, "could Officer Dawson have genuinely believed he was in danger when he discharged his weapon?" The expert, a retired police captain, considered the question. Based on the totality of circumstances, it's possible he perceived a threat. However, he added, and Raymond saw Walsh stiffen, the body camera evidence doesn't support that perception. There was no observable threat action from Agent Wilson. It wasn't the answer Walsh had wanted, and his redirect questions couldn't repair the damage. The defense rested their case that afternoon. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning. That night, Raymond and Diane sat on their back porch, the evening air warm around them. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Raymond considered the question. Ready for it to be over. Ready for the jury to decide. "Do you think they'll convict?" "The evidence is clear," Raymond said, "but juries can be unpredictable, especially with police officers." Diane reached for his hand. "You did everything right. On the stand, and that night." "I know." Raymond squeezed her hand. "But sometimes doing everything right isn't enough." They sat in silence for a while, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow the attorneys would make their final arguments, and then the case would go to the jury. The weeks of testimony would be condensed into deliberations that might take hours or days. Raymond thought about Dawson, sitting in his cell tonight, perhaps also contemplating what the jury might decide. He thought about the text messages, the casual racism that had ultimately led to violence. He thought about his shoulder still aching when it rained, a permanent reminder of that night. Most of all, he thought about what would come after, regardless of the verdict. How this case might affect policing, might make officers think twice before acting on prejudice, might give victims the courage to come forward, or how an acquittal might reinforce the belief that a badge could shield someone from consequences. "Whatever happens," Raymond said finally, "people have seen the truth that matters." As darkness fell completely, they went inside, preparing for the final day of a trial that had become about much more than one shooting on a rainy night. It had become about accountability, about systems of power, about whether justice could truly be blind to the color of a uniform. The jury had been deliberating for 26 hours. Raymond sat in a small conference room at the courthouse with Diane, District Attorney Park, and Olivia Chen from the DOJ. The waiting was the hardest part, harder than testifying, harder even than the months of recovery. "It's actually a good sign," Park said, checking his watch for the dozenth time that hour. "Quick verdicts usually favor the defense. The longer they deliberate, the more likely they're working through the charges carefully." Raymond nodded, though the words provided little comfort. In his years with the FBI, he'd seen cases with overwhelming evidence still end in acquittals, or hung juries. The justice system was unpredictable, especially when the defendant wore a badge. "They've requested to review the dash cam footage again," Chen added, "and the text messages. They're being thorough." Outside the courthouse, media vans had been parked for days. The case had captured national attention, becoming a focal point in ongoing debates about policing, accountability, and race. Raymond had avoided watching the coverage, but couldn't escape knowing it was happening. His face and Dawson's appeared, on television screens across the country, their lives and actions dissected by people who had never met either of them. Just after noon on the second day of deliberations, Raymond's phone buzzed with a text from Park. "Verdict reached. Court reconvenes in 30 minutes. The walk back into the courtroom felt surreal. Raymond was acutely aware of every detail. The polished wooden barriers, the American flag beside the judge's bench, the scratched surface of the table where he sat with the prosecution team. Across the aisle, Dawson entered with his attorney, his expression unreadable. The gallery filled quickly. Raymond felt Diane's hand slip into his as Judge Rivera entered and called the court to order. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict," the judge said. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman who had taken copious notes throughout the trial, stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The forewoman's voice was clear and unwavering. "We find the defendant guilty." A wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Raymond felt a sudden lightness, as if a weight he'd been carrying had lifted slightly. "On the count of assault, with a deadly Weapon, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of violation of civil rights under color of law, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of hate crime, how do you find? There was a brief pause, the tension in the room palpable. Guilty. The word echoed in the suddenly silent courtroom. Raymond heard Dawson's mother let out a sob from somewhere behind him. He didn't turn around. His focus remained forward, his breathing carefully controlled. Judge Rivera thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. As the court was dismissed, chaos erupted in the gallery. Reporters rushing for the doors, supporters and family members reacting to the verdict. Through it all, Raymond sat still, processing what had just happened. Dawson was led away by court officers. His shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, he looked directly at Raymond, not with the hatred or defiance Raymond might have expected, but with something that looked almost like resignation. Outside the courthouse, Park gave a brief statement to the press. Today's verdict sends a clear message that no one is above the law and that those entrusted with badges and guns will be held to the highest standards of conduct. Raymond declined to speak to reporters. There would be time for statements later. For now, he wanted to go home with Diane, to sit in the quiet of their living room and let the reality of the verdict settle around him. The 2 weeks between verdict and sentencing passed in a blur of activity. Raymond returned to limited field duty at the FBI. His shoulder finally healed enough for him to qualify on the shooting range again, though with slightly lower scores than before his injury. The constant pain had diminished to an occasional ache, usually when he was tired or the weather changed. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, some supporting him, others criticizing him for what they saw as an attack on policing itself. Raymond read some, ignored others, and tried to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. The day of sentencing arrived with a fresh wave of media attention. The courthouse steps were once again crowded with cameras and reporters as Raymond made his way inside. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Judge Rivera began by addressing the numerous sentencing recommendations the court had received, including letters from police organizations arguing for leniency and civil rights groups pushing for the maximum sentence. This court has considered all perspectives, she said, but must ultimately be guided by the law and the specific circumstances of this case. She turned her attention to Dawson, who stood with his attorney. Mr. Dawson, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on all counts. Before I pronounce sentence, you have the right to make a statement to the court. Dawson cleared his throat. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed genuinely uncertain. Your Honor, I never intended for anyone to get hurt that night. I made a split-second decision that I have to live with for the rest of my life. I'm sorry for the pain I caused Agent Wilson and his family. The apology sounded rehearsed, lacking genuine remorse. He didn't acknowledge the racial motivation the jury had found, or the text messages that had revealed his true attitudes. Judge Rivera nodded, then turned to Raymond. Agent Wilson, you also have the right to address the court before sentencing. Raymond stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. He had thought carefully about what he wanted to say, discussed it with Diane, with his FBI colleagues, with the prosecutors. In the end, he'd decided on the unvarnished truth. Your Honor, what happened to me that night wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was the result of hatred and prejudice given power through a badge and a gun. I was targeted because of who I am, not anything I did. Raymond paused, gathering his thoughts. I've spent 15 years in law enforcement. I believe in the system when it works properly. Today, I'm asking the court to show that the system can work, that it can hold accountable those who abuse their authority, regardless of the uniform they wear. He sat down, his heart pounding but his voice having remained steady throughout. Diane squeezed his hand under the table. Judge Rivera took a moment before speaking again. In my 20 years on the bench, few cases have troubled me as deeply as this one. Law enforcement officers are given extraordinary power and trust. When that trust is violated, the damage extends far beyond a single victim. It erodes the foundation of our justice system itself. She looked directly at Dawson. The evidence presented at trial showed not only a deliberate act of violence but a pattern of bias and prejudice that culminated in the shooting of a federal agent. This court cannot and will not tolerate such abuse of power. The courtroom was completely silent as she continued. Thomas Dawson, on the count of attempted murder, this court sentences you to 14 years in federal prison. On the counts of assault with a deadly weapon, violation of civil rights, and hate crime, you are sentenced to 10 years for each count, to be served concurrently. 14 years. The sentence hung in the air. Not the maximum possible, but substantial enough to send a message. Around the courtroom, reactions varied. Some nodded in satisfaction, others shook their heads in disagreement. As Dawson was led away, Raymond felt no joy, no vindication, only a quiet certainty that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Outside the courthouse, Raymond finally agreed to make a brief statement to the waiting press. "Today isn't about one officer or one victim," he said, the cameras capturing his every word. "It's about upholding a principle that should apply to everyone who serves in law enforcement, that the badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield from accountability. I hope this case helps ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." In the months that followed, Raymond gradually returned to his normal duties at the FBI. The case faded from the headlines, replaced by new controversies and crises. But its impact continued to ripple outward. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs addressing bias and use of force. Body cameras became standard issue in jurisdictions that had previously resisted them. Complaints against officers that might once have been buried received more thorough investigation. 1 year after the shooting, Raymond was invited to speak at the FBI Academy to new recruits about his experience. Standing before the rows of eager faces, he didn't dwell on the shooting itself or the trial that followed. Instead, he spoke about responsibility. "The power we're given comes with an obligation," he told them, "not just to enforce the law, but to embody its highest principles, to protect everyone equally, regardless of who they are or what they look like." As he spoke, Raymond caught sight of his reflection in the window, the slight stiffness in his left shoulder the only visible reminder of that rainy night. The wound had healed, leaving a scar that would always be part of him. Like the system itself, imperfect, but not beyond repair. "Our job isn't just to make arrests or solve cases," he concluded. "It's to build trust. Because without trust, a badge is just a piece of metal, and justice is just a word." After the lecture, a young recruit approached him, asking how he had found the strength to return to duty after everything he'd been through. Raymond considered the question carefully, because what happened to me was a failure of an individual, not the entire system. And the only way to fix a broken system is from within, by people who care enough to make it better. As he drove home that evening, Raymond thought about Dawson, serving his sentence in federal prison. He thought about the changes, small but significant, that had come from his case. And he thought about all the work still to be done, the biases to be confronted, the reforms to be implemented, the trust to be rebuilt. The road ahead was long, but for the first time since that night, Raymond felt genuinely hopeful that it was leading somewhere better.